Hello, everyone, and welcome on behalf of the Compliance Panel. I would just like to say thank you for joining us today, and I hope that this will be an educational experience for all of us. Before we start, you can see that David had mentioned that I'm employed by Analogic Corporation, and there's a little housekeeping to do before I start, and that please note that all information and views expressed in this article are those of the presenter and do not necessarily represent the views of and should not be attributed to Analogic Corporation. So with that, let's get started. Our objectives today is to provide you with an explanation of what the CFRs are, particularly the 21 CFR, Part 820, its history, how it relates to the ISO standards for medical devices, and an overview of each of the 15 subparts, and then I will have a conclusion and question session at the end. If you have any questions, you can hold them to the end, or you can send them through the chat session so that we can see them during the process, but I would like to hold the questions until we get to the end of the session. So, as we go forward through a history of the GMP or QSR, Quality System Regulation, this requirement was initially released in July of 1978, and its original title was Manufacture, Packaging, Storage, Installation of Medical Devices, Regulations Establishing Good Manufacturing Practices, or GMP, and it also sometimes referred to as Current GMP or CGMP. In 1978, there were no other quality system regulations at the time this was released, such as ISO 9001 or ISO 13485, as we have today. And it was not until the 90s that the ISO 9000 series was established by the International Organization for Standardization, along with the American Society of Quality Control. And then also in the 90s, we got the EN 46001, 46002, which were medical device quality system standards, and those have evolved into ISO 13485, which first came into use in the early 2000s. And these are now the industry standards for obtaining certifications. I'm sure most of you who are in this industry have an ISO 13485 compliant quality system. Without going into further detail, the FDA updated the QSR to add design control requirements in 1998. And when they did that, they somewhat aligned it with the ISO 13485. And there's some significant differences between 1345 and Part 820, and we'll look at these as this presentation continues. And also, there's current considerations for global harmonization under the GHTF. For instance, the FDA now has a third-party audit program in place where your notified body that comes in and gives you your 1345, maybe one of the groups of notified bodies that have been recognized by the FDA to perform their FDA, what they call QSIT, Quality System Inspection Technique audits. So in lieu of having the FDA come in to audit or investigate at your facility, you could have your notified body, as part of your annual audit, do the QSIT audit, and they could be able to submit that to the FDA to keep, or in lieu of having the FDA come to audit your facility. And again, this is required for all device manufacturers worldwide who are intending to distribute or market medical devices within the United States. Okay, just a little history. The Biologics Control Act that was passed in the United States in July 1902 came as the result of two incidents which involved the deaths of children caused by contaminated vaccines. And both of the incidents were attributed to the failure of proper procedures and testing by local officials. Now, there's a big talk, obviously everyone's aware of the H1N1 vaccines that are out there, and were they properly tested, and you know, those types of things, were the clinical trials done properly. But you can see this goes all the way back, you know, 107 years to where they were using diphtheria antitoxin. And the result of the act that was that was done in 1902 was that it required inspections and testing of biological products for purity and strength prior to their use by the public. So this goes way back over 100 years. The next big moment in FDA history was the Pure Food and Drug Act of June 30th, 1906. And here it was federal law provided that federal inspection of meat products and forbidden the manufacture, sale, or transportation of adulterated food products. So I'm sure some of you remember The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. You might have had to read it in high school or in college, where they went through the meat processing plants in Chicago. Well, based on what happened of what was published by Upton Sinclair, this Pure Food Act came out in 1906. Another episode that caused some more regulations to be put in place was the Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act in 1938, which gave the FDA the authority to oversee food, drugs, and cosmetics. And this was introduced by the death, because of the death of more than 100 patients due to sulfonamide medication, where diethylene glycol, which is a form of antifreeze, was used to dissolve the drug and make it a liquid form, which caused a lot of adverse effects to the people who were using it. So this was back in 1938. In 1968, the electronic product radiation control provisions were added, and this act has been, and the FD&C Act has been amended many times, but in 1968 is where they added control for X-ray equipment, equipment with lasers, and equipment today that's under the radiation control would be, even laser light shows that are given at facilities, concert halls, and things like that. There are provisions for them to disclose that information to the FDA. The first modern code that could be considered GMP came out in Canada in 1957, and the Canadians put this in place to assure that drugs supplied to the military met quality specifications. This was following the success of that regulation. GMP started being used by regulatory agencies at a rapid pace, and the U.S. FDA issued its first version, the first preliminary version of the GMPs in 1963. So on July 21st, 1978, as I said earlier, the FDA published the original version of 21 CFR Part 820, which is the Code of Federal Regulations associated for the quality system control of medical devices. And currently, the 21 CFR Part 820 is pretty much aligned with ISO 13485, which you all know is an international standard specific to medical devices, and we'll get into the details a little bit more. The Safe Medical Device Act of 1990 and the Medical Device Amendments Act of 92 required that personnel report any incident in which medical device may have caused or contributed to a death. So here's where they implemented the requirements for MDR, medical device reporting. And this was statute defines a serious illness or an injury as life-threatening or results in a permanent impairment of a body function or structure, or needs any immediate medical or surgical intervention. So this was, if this happened related to your device, prior to 1992, you weren't required to report this to the FDA, but that's when this part was implemented. And it's interesting to see that how the FDA defines a medical device, and it's an instrument, apparatus, implement, machine, contrivance, implant, in vitro reagent, or other similar or related article, including a component or part, which can be used to in the diagnosis of disease or other conditions. So the definition that the FDA uses, if you're familiar with the medical device directive in the EU, their recent revision back in September 2007. So there's a kind of there's a difference between what the FDA has for a definition of a medical device and what the EU has for a definition of a medical device. And some examples of medical device are simple things such as catheters and syringes, all the way up to, the implantable defibrillators, hospital beds, radiology equipment, those types of things. Okay, and then in 1997, the FDA Modernization Act focused on reforming regulation of food and cosmetics. The law directed the FDA to focus its post-market surveillance on higher risk devices. So as you got more and more kind of critical devices into the marketplace in the late 90s and early 2000s, this directed them to focus its post-market surveillance on these higher risk devices rather than the lower risk devices. And it allowed the agency to implement a reporting system that concentrated on a representative sample of user facilities such as hospital, nurses' homes, and nursing homes that experienced death and serious illnesses or injuries linked with the use of these devices. And the law also expanded an ongoing pilot program, which I spoke of earlier, which implemented the third-party experts to conduct an initial review of Class 1 and low to intermediate risk Class 2 devices. This act, however, specified that an accredited person may not review devices that are permanently implantable. So they limit who has the availability to review these devices as a third party to those Class 1 and Class 2 devices. And then finally here, the most recent addition was in September of 2007 when President Bush signed into law the FDA Amendments Act of 2007, which is also known as by the acronym of FDAAA. Among the many components of this law, the Prescription Drug User Fee Act was put into place, and the Medical Device User Fee and Modernization Act, or MDU-FMA, or MDUFMA as it's been called. They reauthorized that, and that actually added additional fees to medical device manufacturers for when you submit, for instance, a 510K for review, when you submit a PMA for review, or every year, for instance, when you do your establishment registration. These fees weren't part of the review process before because they were paid for by tax dollars from all the taxpayers in the United States. But now, when you submit a 510K or when you submit a PMA, and all the establishments, for instance, for this year, starting the FDA's fiscal year starts October 1st, you have to submit $2,008 to the FDA prior to letting them register your establishment for the next fiscal year. Okay, so what is a CFR? A CFR are the Code of Federal Regulations, and it's the codification of general and permanent rules published in the Federal Register every day by the executive departments and agencies of the federal government. There are 50 different titles listed on the government website, and all these CFRs are available online. And Title 21 is dedicated to the FDA, with parts 800 to 1299 dedicated to food, drugs, and medical devices. Changes to these titles are published in the Federal Register, which is released daily by the U.S. government, and each title is fully updated annually. And Title 21 is published on or around April 1st every year. And again, these are all available on the FDA website. And every day you can subscribe to a table of contents for the Federal Register update. And this was one from Monday, October 5th, 2009, and all I pulled out was what the Food and Drug Administration updated on that day. And on October 5th, they proposed some new rules on CGMP for combination products, which is a combination of biologics and medical devices. So every single day, all of the offices of the U.S. government update the Federal Register, and that's how they convey all of these requirements to the general public. So 21 CFR Part 820 has 15 subparts. Subpart A, general provisions, and you can see them here. I don't need to read them all. Up to Subpart H is the first section, and that would be acceptance activities. And then the next slide down has the remaining subparts from non-conforming product, corrective and preventive action, labeling, etc., down to statistical techniques, and we will go through these individually. So Subpart A is the general provision, and basically it's the scope, any definitions, and 820.5 gives you the quality system, which basically gives you the law. Each manufacturer shall establish and maintain a quality system that is appropriate for the specific medical devices. So overall, as we look at the scope of this law, if you look at it from your job or from your employee as a responsibility, it's every employee's responsibility to know that these regulations exist and that we are obligated to abide by them. These are non-negotiable. I mean, they're required by any manufacturer of medical devices intended for use in the United States. So, for instance, if someone there's a lot of manufacturing going on in China. If they intend to sell or market the device that they have designed and manufactured in China into the United States, they're required to have a quality system that meets these guidelines. And as we go through this review, you'll notice that the words documented and record will appear dozens of times, and this theme follows throughout the remainder of this presentation, and it's similar to any quality management system such as ISO 1345 or ISO 9001. You need the paperwork to back up the fact that you've performed these tasks. Subpart B is the quality system requirements, and here there's management responsibility. So we all need to know that the person responsible for implementing this process is your CEO or president or business unit manager, whoever is in charge of the facility where you work at, and this will be otherwise known as the management with executive responsibility. When the FDA comes to visit your facility, they will ask for the individual who is in charge, and that's typically the woman or the man who is your CEO or president. As part of their responsibilities, the management with executive responsibility, they'll appoint a management representative for your organization. Now, sometimes this is the head of quality for the group, but it can be anyone that's designated as the management representative. And this is also the management rep that you would use for your ISO certification. And this individual kind of acts as the liaison between your organization and outside organizations. In each FDA establishment registration, when you register your establishment every year, if you go into the database, you'll see who the establishment contact is. For instance, if you were to go into Analogic on the FDA database, you would see my name is listed as the establishment contact. And additionally, if you're involved in the design or the manufacture of the product as part of your day-to-day activities, you'll be involved in annual internal, external audits. And your activity during these audits may become documented and become part of the audit record. When the FDA refers to management, again, they're referring to the individual with the highest authority in the facility. It is ultimately their responsibility to ensure that these QSR requirements are properly implemented. And management is also responsible for establishing a quality policy, providing an organizational structure with necessary resources with the proper interrelationships between the disciplines and for appointing a management representative, as I said earlier. Additionally, they're responsible for performing a management review at defined intervals. So either biannually or annually, the head of your organization is responsible to do a review of the quality system to make sure that it is functioning properly to the requirements of the CFRs. Part 820.22 requires that audits be performed. And again, this is specifically saying by individuals not having direct responsibility for the area being audited. So it could be someone from another manufacturing group. It could be an engineer that's outside of the engineer, but normally these are quality auditors who are part of a corporate QA group. But it depends on the size of your organization whether or not you have, the facility or the structure available to have a separate QA group. But again, it has to be independent of the group that's being audited. 820.25 is very important because it explains the necessity for properly trained personnel. And one very important note that's under the clause of 820.25 is that personnel who are responsible for releasing the product, in other words, the people who are saying this product is good or this device is good for use in a clinical environment, they must be made aware of the defects and errors that could occur. So as part of training within your organization, the people who release the product need to know that if this product doesn't work correctly, what can happen, what are the adverse events that would be associated with this. Subpart C is design controls, and this wasn't in the original 21 CFR. This came in 1998. And if you're part of the engineering or quality functions, this subpart is very important. And your organization should have numerous operational documents or SOPs which have been documented to control the design process. And as you get involved with the design process, you'll need to be familiar with those operational documents in order to perform those specific duties, and an output of which may be an associated record. And records is a big, important part of this, being compliant with this. So these procedures should be brought to your attention by your supervisor or through additional training modules within your organization. And design controls here starts with the conceptual part of design, which is design planning, all the way out to design history file, design changes, etc. So there needs to be controls in place for the whole design process. Document controls for engineering and manufacturing personnel. Document control is a major portion of your job function. You need to know that you're using the correct revision of the documents as well as know that they have been released correctly. Again, there should be many operational documents within your organization which control these. And under document controls are the approval and distribution. And document changes, it states that the disciplines who originally approved and released the documents must be the same disciplines that approve document changes, so that you can't have manufacturing, quality, engineering, and operations say approve the original document and then do a document change to it and just have the engineers say, I approve this change. The same individuals, the same disciplines have to be involved throughout the document change process as well. Purchasing controls. It's important for all of you to understand that any materials or services that are used in the manufacture or processing of the device must be purchased from well-controlled suppliers. And this has become a big point in the FDA's audit activity because so much materials are being outsourced outside of the country. So they're concentrating a lot more on your supplier controls, how you control your suppliers. And as part of your suppliers, this also includes services that if you send stuff out for sterilization, if you send stuff out for plating of metals, things like that. Those are outsourced services, and they also have to be controlled. Also consultants. If you hire consultants for a specific task, say to write you some software or to design a plastic part for your device, they must also be evaluated for their capabilities. And somewhere somebody has to say this person is capable of performing this task that we've hired them to consult for. And again, all the evidence backing these decisions needs to be available for inspection by the FDA. Manufacturing personnel. Here you must be able to identify the current manufacturing status for any assembly or subassembly in the production area, and that's where Subpart F comes in, its identification and traceability. So you'll find that this is handled by using like material travelers or records and product-specific documentation. But it's very important that you keep these records both accurate and legible. And for instance, if these are records that are done by hand, if you ever need to change a handwritten record, it should be struck through by a single line, initialed and dated with the new value written next to it, so that it's not just scribbled out. And each manufacturer of a device that is intended for surgical implant, and this falls under 820.65, the traceability part, intended for surgical implant into the body or to support or sustain life, and if the failure of that device when it was properly used with instructions for use can reasonably be expected to result in a significant injury to the user, they have to maintain procedures for identifying for a control number for each lot, batch, unit of the finished device, and where appropriate, the components that they used in there. So this is used to facilitate corrective action in case there's a problem. You have to know where this particular class of device is so that you may recall it properly. I mean, if there's problems with a implanted defibrillator, for instance, or a pacemaker, those all have to be traced right down to the patient so that the manufacturer can say, gee, I have a problem with the software in this, or there's a problem with the batteries where they're not lasting long enough, that they know exactly where they are so they can be recalled. So that's where the traceability requirements of 820.65 fit in. Subpart G for production and process controls. Since here we talk about manufacturing changes and personnel, buildings, equipment, inspection, measurement, and test equipment. And as engineers and manufacturing personnel perform tasks, you need to ensure that all equipment is calibrated and that a valid calibration sticker is applied to the equipment where necessary, and that any periodic maintenance has been performed. Now, this is easy for something like a meter or an oscilloscope or something like that. But where you design your own test equipment, you may have a test fixture, or you may have a subassembly that's like a golden sample that's going to be used to verify your other parts of the device or even the device itself, that you have to include those as part of your calibration or your preventive maintenance process, and that these items are validated periodically so that you know that anything in-house is still working in the same manner as it was designed to be used. And then manufacturing changes up at 820.70, manufacturing changes, personnel, buildings, equipment, all these things have to be documented properly. And then any manufacturing materials that go in need to be properly removed. So for instance, if you're manufacturing PC boards, for instance, they go through a solder process, and then they go through a cleaning process to remove like flux from those boards. Those manufacturing materials that are not intended to be included with the device, you have to have records that they're properly removed from the device as well. Subpart H applies to the inspection and test personnel. As incoming or in-process inspection is performed, you need to know that you're following the correct work instructions and that you document these activities properly. Once a component or a completed device has been through an acceptance process, you have to suitably identify its status per any documented procedures that you have. And again, we talk about procedures and records. They're necessary for each one of these subparts. And any records accompanying the device must be captured and filed per the documented procedures. So here's where you're releasing finished devices into clinical use. So here's where you'll need to know where they're being distributed to, and what the serial numbers for those particular devices, or what the batch was for those particular devices so that if there is an adverse event and you need to get them back, you know where they are. For manufacturing and quality personnel, non-conforming product would be an important subpart. It's imperative that whenever any non-conforming material is identified at any point during the manufacturing or inspection process, that you can identify it and segregate it from its use. So I'm sure your organization has what's called a material review board or an MRB, and these are set up for reviewing and dispositioning non-conforming material. And it's through the effort of the people who provide the documentation and the material to the MRB that they provide them with accurate and clear information, so it'll allow the MRB to properly perform their tasks. And again, the MRB is required to maintain records of any decisions that were made, and any rework that is performed has to be subject to the same inspection as was to the original part or the device itself. So there has to be records of the rework any rework that was made at the same time. Subpart J deals with corrective and preventive action. So as part of your quality management system, there should be implemented a corrective and preventive action, or a CAPA system. And although this system is ordinarily monitored and controlled by the various quality groups, all of you must be aware that whenever you see an opportunity for improvement, you should provide the information to the appropriate quality representative. And under the CAPA, there's the requirement to analyze all process results, audits, service records, complaints, etc., to see where you can improve the product, or even identify where the product is not safe and effective where it was supposed to be. So there has to be an investigation made. And then there has to be verification and validation of the implemented CAPA effectiveness. If you're going to change a process, or if you implement a change to the device related to an audit finding, or because of a corrective and preventive action is necessary, you need to validate that when you implemented that CAPA, that it actually did what it was supposed to do. This is an area which is normally omitted as part of people's quality system, that they implement the corrective action, they implement the preventive action, but they don't go back and see that it had an effective, it was properly effective to correct the situation. And the CAPA system provides us with a vehicle for continuous improvement of the product and processes, and inputs and outputs from the CAPA system are forwarded all the way up the ladder to executive management to be used during their periodic management review of the quality management system. So this is something as part of the standard quality system investigation technique that the FDA does. One of the things that they're going to look at almost 100% of the time is your CAPA system. And so this is something that really needs to be well documented and have a closed loop system so that you know that the CAPAs have been properly and effectively implemented. Subpart K deals with labeling and packaging. And this has an interesting twist on it by the fact that when we think of labeling, we think of stickers and other labels that are applied directly to the product or its packaging. And the twist is that labeling, as seen through the eyes of the FDA, is any written or displayed information which could be accompanying your device, or it could be product brochures, or it could be information that's on your website. So you have to be very careful on your labeling. It's very important that it all gets reviewed and validated and its content validated so that you don't violate any laws by making false claims. A lot of times marketing people will place stuff up on your website. I know as part of my job, I have to review all of the web pages before they're placed on the Analogic website so that they've been reviewed properly and it's understood that we're not putting anything up there that shouldn't be written. And again, you're required to document and record the activity associated with the review and approval of labeling. So labeling becomes part of, you know, any other document that gets reviewed. And another part of labeling is a user interface. If you have displays on your product, anything that's displayed to an end user would be considered labeling. And then device packaging under 82130, obviously just it's common sense. You want to make sure that your packaging protects the device. So there's many test procedures that are standards out there that your reliability engineers or other people would, your engineering group, product assurance, would use to test the device in its package before it ships out. Subpart L, handling, storage, distribution, and installation is basically common sense. Here you all have the responsibility to handle all materials, sub-assemblies, and finished devices with care so as to preclude damage. So you want to, handle it, storage, distribute it, and install it. There's got to be procedures for this. And you also want to use FIFO, first in, first out, so there's proper rotation of your inventory. And there's also a requirement that you keep records of any installations you perform. So if you're, installing a big system such as an MRI system, you need to keep the instructions and the records of those installations, and you also have to write instructions for how the installation should be done. In some cases, for very large equipment, such as an MRI system, you would get a site plan from the hospital, or you would provide them with a site plan as to how much area they need to install a device such as that. So that's where installation instructions would be important. Now, subpart M, records. And every subpart of this CFR that we've gone through required records of some sort. And subpart M is probably the most important of all the subparts that we've discussed. These records are maintained so that you can provide to the FDA and maintain for yourselves that you've followed the specific requirements, whether they be specified by the FDA regulations or by your own quality management system or your own product-specific documentation. This will hold true for your ISO documentation as well. As you go through an ISO audit, they're going to want to see the records saying, here's my procedure on how I do incoming inspection. Well, show me a record that's how you've done it. Here's my procedure for design review. This is, show me the procedure and show me the records that show that you followed your procedure. So I can't stress enough the importance of this subpart and how it relates to all job functions. You all have a part in establishing and maintaining some pieces of these records, and it's imperative that you follow all of the necessary procedures to keep these records accurate and up to date. The records defined here are not only for the benefit of showing a third party, but also for your own benefit, so that you have the capability of reviewing at a later date an historical record of the processes and their outputs, so that if there is something, an adverse event in the field, and you need to go back and say, how many of these devices did we build this way, or what happened with this particular batch, where did we use these components, that you have all these records in place in order to answer those questions for yourself. So we're going to go through these probably a little individually so that we see a little bit more about how the records play a role here. The requirements of 820.180 is that the requirements of this section provides the FDA with all of the documentation to show that you are in compliance with their regulations. So all these records have to be made available to the FDA for review. If anything you feel is confidential, as the FDA comes through your facility and performs their investigation or their audit, if they ask for copies of certain records and you feel that they're confidential, then you need to stamp them confidential, because any and all information gathered by the FDA becomes part of public record under the Freedom of Information Act. So under the Freedom of Information, if you have a supplier, for instance, that's supplying you with a finished device that's an accessory to your device, you can, through Freedom of Information, apply to the FDA to say, I would like a copy of their last establishment facility audit, and you can obtain that. So anything that you want that you feel is confidential must be marked that way, or it can become part of public record. There are also exceptions to what the FDA can look at when they come through. For instance, they can't look at your audit reports, they can't look at your management reviews, or your supplier audits. And this was done for a reason, so that they didn't have a backdoor entry. For instance, if you're buying from a supplier that in itself is a medical device manufacturer, that if they come in and look at your supplier audit of that facility, they don't have any information relating to that site before they go do an audit there. So this is much different from an ISO auditor who has privy to look at all of these requirements. So even though they can't ask for these reports, such as management reviews or supplier audits, you do, however, have to have evidence that these action occurred. So you should put a letter on file that states, an audit of this area was performed on such and such a date, and there were this many deviations found, and they've all been closed. As similar to supplier audits, that we've done a supplier audit of our critical component manufacturer. It was done on this date, and we've closed any issues that were associated with them. So a device master record under 820.81. So this record is actually the conglomerate of all the documentation necessary to produce the device in its current configuration. This includes not only the product documentation, such as the bill of materials, assembly drawings, and test procedures, but also all of the operational documents, such as the incoming inspection procedure, your design review procedure, your design change procedure, and all the other SOPs which are needed to produce the device. And it's important to understand that each time a device's revision changes, the device master record also changes. And it's required that we have a sound and documented methodology for creating, maintaining, and changing the device master record. And again, this methodology should be covered by a combination or a single operational document that's maintained by your organization. In contrast to the device master record, you now have a device history record. And the device history record is the evidence that you followed the device master record, or the recipe to manufacture the device. So here the DHR compiles all of the manufacturing records associated with a specific device or a batch of devices. You must ensure that all of your finished devices are tested or inspected either in 100% or sampled in batches, and you must have the aligning records. As you move back through the manufacturing process, you may have other batch records, such as for printed circuit boards that were produced for inclusion in the finished device. And again, as I said earlier, any handwritten changes should have a single line through them with an initial and a date. And as we look on the bullets of this slide, you'll see what's required in the device history record. And again, it's evidence that's manufactured in accordance with the device master record, the date of manufacture, the quantity manufactured, the quantity released for distribution. And it's important that all the required information for materials are recorded so that if a recall is necessary, you'll have specific knowledge of where the affected devices are located. Now again, the level of component, the level of detail that you go to in your device history record is up to you. I mean, you can take it all the way down to, a screw or, a resistor on a circuit board. But it's all up to you what level you need to go by, because if you ever have to do a recall, you need to be able to put your arms around that group of devices that need to be recalled, or you'll end up recalling everything that you shipped within a certain time period if you don't know where you used specific components. So it's up to you to make the determination of what the level of detail you'll have in your device history record. Part 820.186 is quality system records, and this section defines the requirements for records which are not a part of the DMR or the DHR, such as audit reports, management reviews, quality trend reports, CAPRs, non-conforming material reports, all these things. And these are basically all of the records for the subparts that aren't specifically defined as requiring a record, such as DMR and DHR. Next, we have complaint files, and this complaints are usually the main focus of an FDA audit. I know when they've come to my facility, the first thing they ask to see is the person in charge, and then when he has gone through his introductions and giving them the escorts, the next thing they want to look at is your customer complaints. And as you can see by this slide, the definition of a complaint carries a very broad range of communications, and any and all employees could be the recipient of a complaint. You may not even be in your facility, but you may hear somebody say, well, gee, my friend was at the hospital and they used this this device on them and it didn't work properly, and you may know, well, gee, that's what they make at my facility, so that could be constituted as a complaint. So there's not just a certain person, individual in your organization who can receive it. They may be the individual who coordinates the information once it's received, but anyone as part of your organization can be a recipient of a complaint. And you must have a very stringent procedure in place on how these are evaluated and investigated. Any safety-related complaints where there was a direct injury or death related to the possibility of an injury or death must be properly documented and relayed to the FDA in specific time frames. In other parts of 21 CFR 800, there are specific details on how these have to be reported. And in the case of a recall, the affected devices can either be replaced, returned for correction, or corrected at the site. In any of these cases, the end user must be notified to stop using the device until a correction is made. So if you have a safety-related issue with your device, it is your responsibility to immediately notify the end users that you should stop using this until we have a correction made to it. In 21 CFR Part 806, that covers what's called a voluntary removal. Here's where you may find something wrong with your product that's not really a safety issue, but may cause it to not work properly. So you become aware of this issue, and it may not even be related to an event that's occurred in the field, but you need to do an action to the product as required. Say there's something that's, there's an unreliable part where this part may fail within 3 months, say, after you release the product. It doesn't really have any safety issues, but that that's something there. So that would be what's called a voluntary recall, and that's covered under 21 CFR Part 806. Okay, Subpart N is servicing, and any device companies which perform their own service must have procedures in place. Analysis of service reports is also important in case there's been an adverse event which triggered the service call, in which case that would become a complaint and would be required to follow the complaint handling procedures. In some cases, it could be inferred that any warranty service required can constitute a complaint as the device failed to meet its reliability specifications. So you need to weigh how these service calls affect the complaint handling process. And any service reports that you do must contain the name and serial number of the device, the date the service was performed, the name of the person who performed the service, and the service performed, and a copy of the test results of the device if applicable. And the last part is statistical techniques, and here they require that procedures identifying valid techniques for the acceptance of process capability and process characteristics. So if you take a sampling plan, for instance, you can't just say, well, I'm going to pick 2 out of 100 and test them, that should be okay. It has to be something that's statistically sound and proven to be statistically sound for you to use that technique. There's a couple of different areas where where statistical techniques are used. One is obviously during inspection process, we use sampling inspection, but there's other techniques such as reliability engineers who predict using mathematical processes mean time between failure of products. And that process would be performed during the design process. Another use of statistics would be used during clinical trials. How many people do you need involved in the trial, and things like that. So here I've provided you with some references. One is medical device good manufacturing practices, and then that link will bring you to that guidance document that was released by the FDA. And the other is Part 20, and that'll bring you to the CFR itself. So in conclusion, I'd just like to say that it's yours and my responsibility to understand where our job function fits within the scheme of these regulations. Some of you may have a daily role in this process, while others may have little or no involvement at all. However, it's important that you realize that 21 CFR 820 and its subparts are the law. These laws have been passed so that we are regulated as an industry to provide safe and effective medical devices for use by healthcare professionals or ourselves. We could be end users. And at the same time, these laws were also passed so that we as potential patients can have assurance that they have been designed, manufactured, labeled, packaged, and distributed, and installed in a manner where we feel safe as well. The best example that I always give when it comes to being in the medical device industry is that someday either you or your family member may wake up inside of or attached to one of the devices that your organization has produced. And because of this, you should take care to remember the seriousness of your job function and how it fits into the scheme of things. So that would conclude my talk for now, and I will be now open for any questions that anyone may have.
Firstly, I would like to thank Chuck for the wonderful presentation and also all the participants for cooperating with us. It is now time for the Q&A to begin, and we request all participants to use the raise hand feature if they have any questions for a presenter, or post their questions on the Q&A panel. Now, if for any reason you were unable to ask your question in doubt, please share it with me, your host, by chat, and I shall get the answer from a presenter. And meanwhile, I sincerely request you to share your feedback in the feedback form that will appear on your screen in the polling window. And Chuck, there's a question from Sarah. I just said it to you.
Okay. Is it required to conduct supplier audits? It's not required to do all supplier audits, but I mean, I would identify those components which are critical to your device and make sure that those suppliers are audited, or at least, you know, you can, it doesn't mean you have to physically go to their facility, but you can send them a survey to see, hey, are you guys ISO 13485 certified, or when's the last time the FDA visited your facility? So it's not important that you do them all, but those components that are key to your device, like, I mean, if you're sending out something out to be sterilized, by all means, you should visit that sterilization facility to make sure they're what you need for your controls.
Thank you, Chuck. Sarah, I have opened the line. Is there any other questions you'd like to ask? And Chuck, may I unmute the participants one? Thank you, Sarah. And may I unmute the participants one by one and ask if they have any questions, Chuck?
Sure.
Maria, any questions from your side?
No, no question.
Okay. And Lauren, do you have any questions for?
Well, actually, yeah, it's ACS. The question that I have is, we are an electronics manufacturing company, and we have several registrations actually in place. We have ISO 9001-2000. We have TS 16949. We have 14001 as well. How critical is 1345, ISO 1345 to our requirements? And basically need to know a little more about ISO 1345. Is it a subset of 9001-2000, or how critical is?
Okay, well, if you have 1345 is ISO 9001 plus. Okay, so if you have 1345, you've met 9001. Now, although there are some differences, 1345 doesn't stress the customer satisfaction that 9001 does. From an FDA standpoint, I mean, they really, they're only concerned that you can meet the 21 CFR 820 requirements. Okay. Outside of that realm, I mean, if you're meeting 9001 and meeting the other standards that you mentioned, I don't think you're doing anything different than what you need to do. The only things that are more enhanced would be the customer complaint process. I mean, you wouldn't see that in 9001 as heavily as it would be in 1345. If you're marketing direct to clinical use devices, that the MDR, the medical device reporting process, much like the vigilance process is for Europe, I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but that would be the same as how the FDA would expect you to handle your complaints. That's the only thing I see as different. But again, you can get those requirements right out of 21 CFR 820 without going through 13485.
Okay.
How do we know if we need? How do we know if we need FDA approval?
How do you know if you need FDA approval? Well, if you are manufacturing a medical device to the definition of a medical device that the FDA uses, and you're a direct sale, I mean, then you know that in that situation, if you have pre-market approval like a 510K or a PMA, which are pre-market approval requirements for medical devices, if your company is manufacturing directly selling medical devices and haven't registered your establishment, for instance, through the FDA, which is required every year, then you need to look at from what you're putting into the marketplace, if it's considered a medical device by the true definition that the FDA uses, or even that the EU uses under the Medical Device Directive. If you're marketing something like that, then I would say you need to follow FDA requirements. Okay. So you have to take a good look at what you're marketing, and does it fall into the category of a medical device? And then, if you're uncertain, there's ways to solicit the FDA to say, hey, this is what I'm manufacturing. Can you tell me what classification this device is? Is it a class 1, which goes from, surgeon's gloves, to a class 3, which is, a stent that goes into a carotid artery, for instance. It's somewhere in between. And then there's a product code for each one of these. So if you go through the 21 CFR Part 800 on the web page, and you can find a category that your product falls into, and in reading through all of the different products that are listed there, if you can say, hey, this is my product, and it'll give you the requirements for it, then yeah, I would say you need to register with the FDA. You need to register that device before you sell it, and you need to follow the 21 CFR 820 requirements.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And Chuck, thank you very much. If anybody has any question, you could always send it to me. My email ID is david@compliancepanel.com, and I will get the answer from a presenter and send it back to you. And Chuck, I don't think any more questions. With your permission, could I conclude the session?
Sure.
We are, ladies and gentlemen, very grateful for your participation in this webinar. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can send us an email at webinars@compliancepanel.com. And if any of you feel that your team members, colleagues, friends will benefit from this event, we're happy to inform you that it will be available in the recorded format and can be bought from our website, or you can call us at 714-441-5856. Now, we welcome your suggestions and feedbacks or ideas on how we can improve our webinars. If you'd like to suggest a topic or desire a customized corporate training, online or on-site, we ensure that whatever is your training necessity, it will be a priority. Now, on behalf of our presenter, Mr. Cefalo, and compliance panel team, I would like to thank you again and wish you all a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.